Aristotle rejected Plato's idealism, I already mentioned. He believed that monarchy was the best form of government, particularly an enlightened monarch. By the way, our Supreme Court members have sometimes been called philosopher kings. Well, what's a philosopher king? A king who makes a decision he does not have to enforce or carry out, that other people enforce and carry out. Some of the decisions our Supreme Court makes are decisions that are just simply impractical. I could give some examples, but I won't now. But he believed, again, democracy was very bad. Now, in the field of science, he classified animals according to their habits. In other words, he classified animals according to whether they laid eggs or gave birth to the young live. Now, we run into a problem. All right, I'll say this. The subject of taxonomy, that's classification. And Aristotle was the first man we know of that attempted to classify animals. Now, according to Jews, King Solomon did, but anyway, we don't know how Solomon classified animals. But Aristotle's classification has some flaws. For instance, you may know that there are some mammals that lay eggs, don't give birth to the, let's see, there's the duckbill that has a beak, like a duck. And there are no living birds with teeth, but there are fossilized birds with teeth. And let's see. Oh yes, Aristotle classified bats in the same class with birds, because any creature that flew was a bird, and the ones that didn't. But now we have fossilized reptiles. We know they were reptiles, but they could fly. I don't know if he classified them as birds or not. We try to classify things based on the theory of evolution, what we believe their ancestors were. And the animals that have the same ancestors, we put in the same class. But to me, there's a problem with that. There's no real, you cannot really say that any one animal descended from another. In our modern day of classification, well, for instance, human beings and octopi have the same kind of eyes. So if you class animals according to their eyes, you put humans and octopi in the same classification. We might say, well, no, we don't do that. But then again, we classify creatures with backbones in one class and creatures without backbones in another. But who's to say that some creatures without backbones might be closely related to each other than two creatures that do have backbones? There are certain types of animals, in fact, a lot of them, that we just arbitrarily put in the class because we don't know where else to put them. They have no characteristics that's in common with hardly anything. So, but rather than put them in a class all by themselves, we finally just agree, well, let's put them in this class here because we don't know any better place to put them. This is true of a lot of Pacific Ocean fish, I've heard. Salmon, types of salmon, just very arbitrary. There is no really good way to classify. You might know the whale and the cow have the same type of hide, same kind of fur, which leads some people to believe that the whale and the cow had the same ancestors. And there's numerous examples of creatures that cannot possibly be related that have the same characteristics, again, like the octopus and human eye. Now, he observed the stars, and he came to the conclusion by observing the North Star. One time, today the North Star is Polaris, but at one time the North Star was Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is still fairly close to the North Star, the big red. I mean, yeah, I call it Betelgeuse. It sounds because that's where it's pronounced, like Beetlejuice. Anyway, Betelgeuse is a very, very large red star that's to the north. But anyway, he reasoned now that if the Earth were flat, the North Star would appear at this angle here, and over here hundreds of miles away at this angle. But instead, what he actually observed was that the North Star appears at a very obtuse angle here, and an even much more obtuse angle here than it would if the Earth were flat. So he concluded from his observation of the North Star that the Earth is round, spherical. Again, based on the angles he observed from different places, different latitudes on the Earth. Now, he also observed when the Moon and Mars crossed each other, he noticed the Moon was in front of Mars, so he concluded correctly that the Moon is closer to the Earth than Mars is. Otherwise, Mars would have passed in front of the Moon. But no, the Moon instead passed in front of Mars. So again, now he was right, but now what I'm about to write on a board. Anybody have any opinions on this? Any of you, I know what your physics teacher would say, yes. It's false. It's false. But here's what he based it on. He observed a feather and a rock. He dropped a feather and he dropped a rock. The rock was heavier than the feather, yes. The rock fell faster than the feather did. But actually he did not know. Now this, because of him, when our astronauts went to the Moon about a generation and a half ago, one of the astronauts carried a feather with him. And he held up a moon rock and a feather and dropped them at the same time. And of course, the Moon's gravity fell much slower than it would on Earth. The rock and the feather landed at the same time. But on Earth, long before that, some man got in a spacesuit and went into a chamber, and he pumped all the air out of the chamber. And he dropped a feather and a rock on the Earth, and the rock and the feather fell at the same time. It's been said that Galileo went up to the Leaning Tower of Pisa with a 100-pound iron ball and a half-pound iron ball, and dropped them both. And actually, the half-pound ball landed first, because the 100-pound ball, he said, was it was hindered by the air. In other words, it took up more airspace, so the air slowed it down. So the smaller, lighter ball landed first. Aristotle has made himself look ridiculous by this statement, which, if with just a little bit more observation, he should have figured out better or should have known better. But again, he made himself look ridiculous later generations. Now, something else where that he obviously was wrong. He said that money is sterile. It can never beget more money. In other words, we should never loan out money with interest, because Aristotle forbade the charging of interest. Here's where he was really badly wrong. Now, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and Lockheed paid its workers every week. And every week, Lockheed pumped millions of dollars into the local society. Well, what if Lockheed could only have paid us when it sold an airplane? Now, Lockheed, unlike cars might sell every day. Lockheed once went 5 months without selling a plane because the planes they were building had a problem with the rudder, and it took weeks to figure out what was wrong. During that time, I mean, the local economy, but the point I'm making is Lockheed was able to pay its workers because it had bank accounts. It could borrow the money from the bank. Again, you might not realize, but to make things like locomotives, automobiles, and banks, automobiles and airplanes, you have to have banks. Without banks, most of you would probably never be able to buy an automobile. Without lending institutions, you'll never be able to buy a home, most of us. Live out in the street until finally you can afford to pay cash for a home, or if you pay rent for a house. Of course, these days, more and more people are paying rent, even though it's actually cheaper to buy, especially. You cannot deduct rent. You can still deduct mortgage loans. But again, more rough start because we're a movable side. But anyway, without meaning to, Socrates probably set back economics by hundreds, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years. So the whole modern economic system is based on the stock market, on debt, on credit, on lending with interest, and on borrowing with interest. The whole economic system goes down the drain. He did not believe in the atom, even though there was a philosopher in his time called Demosthenes who was teaching his disciples that there were atoms, that everything was made of atoms, including Demosthenes said even air is made of atoms. Aristotle said if the air were made of atoms, the atoms would fall to earth like a shower of pebbles. Hey, he was right. The only reason we have an atmosphere is gravity holds the atmosphere in place. A body in space that doesn't have enough gravity to hold on to an atmosphere is airless. So it's gravity that holds our atmosphere. So he was right, and if the atmosphere, if there were gravity, the atmosphere would fall to earth. Well, that's what it does. Again, his lack of belief in the atom may have done a lot to set the science of physics back. Believe it or not, the existence of the atom was still being debated 150 years ago. You had one group of scientists who believed and another group who didn't. Today, I mean, the belief in the atom has led to us making such things as nuclear reactors, CRT screens. I know the CRT is obsolete, but without belief in the atom, we probably never would have built them. Again, Aristotle, maybe we can overlook it. He did not have the science that we had. Women, all right, part of the progression downward. Aristotle had no use for women. He said that the only reason he could see that women existed was to bear children and keep the human race going. Otherwise, this, of course, led to but to him, family life was unimportant. To me, Aristotle sums up what is right and wrong with humanity. The wiser a person gets in one area of his life, the less wise he is often in another. Now, there's a sort of Albert Einstein who explained the universe. I mean, explained the universe in such a way that people of his day believed it. And a lot of people still do. But Einstein is reported to have gone around this neighborhood and finally grabbed a person, please help me. My name is Albert Einstein and I can't find my home. Can you please tell me where I live? Einstein could not match his socks with his tie. And to him, the whole idea of matching clothes was led to utter hysterics. I mean, he would just laugh. He'd read a book on manners and laugh himself to hysterics. Because to him, the whole idea did not make any sense. But again, the more brilliant a person is in one area, sometimes the less brilliant they are in other ways. Aristotle sums that up. Now, that these men were brilliant, I do not doubt. You might say, how can you tell? But one of my younger brothers asked one time, what if you marry a woman and find out she wasn't as smart as you think she is? I said, you won't be talking to a person 5 minutes before you have some idea what their intellectual capacity is. They can't hide it. In the case of Aristotle, you can tell by his writings, here's a man of deep intellect. And yet, a part of him was very, very lacking in the same thing, just that, lacking in intelligence. All right. So much for Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, except to sum up in one sentence, I really believe that their philosophy, between the three of them, destroyed everything it touched. And it destroyed the land of Greece, their homeland. It destroyed the Hellenistic world that came after, destroyed the Roman Empire, and sent Western civilization into what's called the Dark Ages. I blame them more than do others because of their errors, their flaws, their faults. Set mankind back, and it took mankind hundreds of years to recover. If only if, Aristotle would have said it's okay to set up banks and loan money with interest, it's only would have said the family is very important and women are very important, like Plato did. If only he would have believed in the atom, perhaps the Greeks would have put men on the moon within 200 years. Yes, yes, they might have been that close, because once the scientific revolution starts, folks, it progresses geometrically. In other words, most scientific discoveries, I mean, once they start, they go boom, 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 really, really fast. I might be teaching this class on Mars now instead of here on Earth. I mean, but again, these men set man back, and it's taken us all this time to partially recover. All right. Greek religion. The Greeks worshipped the gods who they said lived on Mount Olympus. They chose Mount Olympus because it had a constant cloud cover. Mount Olympus was so tall that the clouds never left it. Now, folk, yes, they had climbed Mount Olympus, and they did understand that they could not see the dwelling of the gods on the top of Mount Olympus, so they believed the gods lived in a spiritual dimension outside of human senses. But nevertheless, they dwelt on Mount Olympus, and they were immortal, never had any sickness, so they called them the blessed. There were several of them. Now, the main one was Zeus. Well, let's start at the beginning. The first original god was Uranus. You might see, if you look at it closely, Uranus is the same as Anu of the Sumerians. Anu, who is the first original of the Sumerian gods. But like Anu, Uranus disappeared from the scene after a while. Actually, he was overthrown. He was overthrown by his son Saturn. Now, the Greeks called him Kronos. Now, when Uranus was overthrown by Saturn, Uranus said to Saturn, "Your sons will overthrow you the same way you overthrew me." So, Saturn then swallowed his three sons. His three sons, Hades, known as Pluto, or Poseidon, known as Neptune, or Zeus, also known as Jupiter. The Greeks and Romans worshiped the same gods. So I'm giving both the Greek and Roman names. Anyway, but one of Saturn's wives gave Saturn something to eat that forced Saturn to, you might say, regurgitate. So he threw up his three sons. His three sons then got together and formed an alliance and overthrew him. And Zeus then took over. Actually, three of them took over. Zeus got the upper world. His brother Poseidon got the sea. I hope I'm spelling it right. And then Hades got the land of the dead, or the netherworld, the world below. Hades is another name for Pluto. Poseidon, Neptune. Zeus, also known as Jupiter. Now, there were several others in the pantheon, some of them more important than others. They had nymphs, spirit creatures that went around doing their job. Pan was goat from the waist down and human from the waist up. Pan was the god of the plants, of the farming. Aphrodite, or otherwise known as Venus, goddess of sex, fertility. Mercury, the fast one. Now again, they observed the planets, and you all know, I guess, that Mercury is a planet. The Greeks called it Hermes. The Romans called it Mercury. Mercury moves across the sky faster than all the other planets because it's close to the sun. Venus is pretty fast, but now Saturn was the old world. So Saturn is very, very, very slow. Now, as for the war god, they called him Ares, or Mars. Mars had two servants, Phobos, fear, Deimos, dread. And guess what? In 1877, we discovered that Mars had two moons. The discoverer named them after the two servants, dread and fear, which is what soldiers feel as they're going into a battle. Now, to celebrate, each of these gods had a special day. Now, for instance, the word Saturn was the god for Saturday, but they had a day of the year also. Now, Saturn's day is known as Saturnia. On Saturn's day, because when Saturn was overthrown, the world was turned upside down. So on Saturn's day, or Saturnia, the masters waited on the slaves. Slave and master changed places. Some people said that both sides hated this. Others said no, the slaves really loved it because for once they got to sit down and be served while their masters waited on them. But again, this would show that when Saturn was overthrown, the world turned upside down. The Greeks also honored Zeus every 4 years by holding an Olympics. I mentioned how that one of their Olympic winners, Thucydides, was overworked and fell down dead. And we don't know what killed Thucydides, that was sheer exhaustion. Heart disease is very, very rare in the Mediterranean because they eat a lot of olives or fish, things like that, that keeps heart disease down from them. So very, very rare, and some people say we need to start eating a Mediterranean diet because the diet that we're eating is not good for us. I'm not questioning that. All right. Now, a lot of emphasis was placed on ritual, festivals, sacrifice. They did not practice human sacrifice as far as I know, but they did practice animal sacrifice. Also, to determine the will of the gods, they visited oracles. They also opened up animals, particularly sheep or sacrificial animals, to look at the color of the intestines. And they believed that the color of an animal's intestines was an indication of which direction the gods wanted to take. If the intestine appeared to be one color, they'd think, well, the gods want us to do this, or it appeared to be another. I want to say this about oracles. Oracles remind me of what you'll read in horoscopes. You'll have a good day today unless you don't. Good fortune is going to come your way. They don't tell you when. But especially now, all right, when King Croesus wanted to go to war against the Persian Empire, the oracle at Delphi told him, if you go to war against Persia, you will destroy a great empire. He went to war against Persia and his own empire was destroyed. When Philip of Macedon went to an oracle to discuss whether he should invade Persia, the oracle answered, the bull has been slain, the sacrifice is ready. He assumed that Persia was a sacrifice, but here the sacrifice went to him. In short order, he himself was assassinated. So on and so forth. Now, the oracles did give Alexander the Great, though, better advice. An oracle told him that everyone who assassinated your father, Philip, is dead. Then the oracle told him your father really was Zeus, so Philip was not really your father because your father was Zeus. At least that was a clear answer, not a vague one. Reminds me of a hurricane forecast. Well, the hurricane might hit Wilmington unless it veers south and hits Charleston instead. You all think, I think you all know what I mean. Or yeah, there's a 30% chance, well actually there's a 60% chance of rain for today. So it'll rain unless it doesn't. In that case, we'll have dry weather. This was typical of the prophecies, the advice the oracles would give people. And oftentimes the advice led them to do things that were utterly idiotic and utterly zany. You'll be surprised how many people, several years ago, there was a toy called an 8-ball, and people would use the 8-ball to spin it around, and it had 8, some of you know what I'm talking about, and they'd use the 8-ball to make their decisions for them. No, folk, don't. Use your upper intellect, your higher level reasoning to make your own decisions. If you don't, you're likely to make decisions that are utterly zany at times, totally without any kind of redeeming quality. All right. Family life. Now, women at first were expected to stay at home. But as time went on, particularly in the days of Socrates, women began to get more freedom and they began to roam more. And it's believed that whatever else you can say about Socrates' wife, they probably got up in the morning and each went their separate ways and never saw each other unless they accidentally bumped into each other. But then they'd come home late in the evening, one get home before the other, and hardly ever even saw each other. This is what is believed to have been Socrates' marriage. The young women were often married as young as 14. Before you say that's too young, keep in mind the average age of death was only about in the late 30s. And I'm not talking about the ones who died in infancy, which would have greatly lowered the average to about 22 or 23. I'm talking about the ones who lived at least 10 years, usually did not live much beyond 40 years, if any. And yet they had a few people, men and women alike, who were said to have lived to be 100. Just a few. But anyway, because life was short, they married the young girls as young as 14. They had a lot of illegitimate children, but only legitimate children were considered citizens. Now, your aristocratic men. Oh, now this is a touchy subject, but I feel like it's in the book, so I'll say it out loud. Your aristocratic men would marry a woman in order to carry on the family name, the family, and have an heir. Only legitimate children could inherit. Now, they had a lot of illegitimate children in Greek society. I think I mentioned this past about Pericles. Illegitimate children could not inherit an estate, but there was another problem. All right, I want to state this, folks. There are no illegitimate children. There are only illegitimate parents. Anyway, the children of illegitimate parents, to put it that way, tended to be incorrigible. And that gave them a bad name, and this is somewhat true to this day. Yes?
I actually, the definition of illegitimate child escapes me.
Illegitimate children are children who are who are not born to a lawful wedded marriage. In other words, where you have a wedding, and hey, I've been asked that before, can you define illegitimate? Where a couple has a wedding, and then the children that come from the wedding, the lawful wedded union, are considered legitimate, and the children born outside a wedded union are considered illegitimate. All right. Now, the aristocrats, so in addition to having their wife, they almost always would have some young boy who was their homosexual lover. Again, your book says that we don't know if this was done by the common class or not. I will say this, with the gods doing it themselves, the philosophers approving of it, and the upper classes doing it, it's difficult to imagine what this might not have spread down to the lower classes. We don't have records of it. The views about women now went from downhill, beginning with Socrates, who was at least married, to Plato, who had a fairly high view of women, to Aristotle, who his view of women was nearly zero. We're going to run to the same progression when we come to Rome. All right, I'll state it. I think I'm fearful saying it. As the women got more elevated, their respect for themselves and the respect